This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. We're really excited to get to speak with Samantha Baskind today. Professor Baskind is the Distinguished Professor of Art History at Cleveland State University. She's the author of 6 books, including Moses Jacob Ezekiel, Jewish Confederate Expatriate Sculptor, coming out in September 2025. And Samantha is also the series editor of Dimyonot, Jews and the Cultural Imagination, which is published by Penn State University Press. So it's great to have you here, Samantha.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.
So I realized something else that I might have added to the introductions is that you are also the museum's correspondent for the Smithsonian Online Magazine. Can you tell us about how this came about?
This was a fortuitous set of circumstances. I'd been already feeling some discontent with academic publishing when this started. I had 5 books under my belt, and each challenged me in a different way. They were different kinds of projects. And an artist that I have worked with, who has since died, was reaching a pinnacle in her career. And so I pitched an article to Smithsonian where she has several works of art, and a new one was going to be acquired soon, about her and her life. And Smithsonian at the time was also interested in women artists, and they had a grant to feature that, and it was accepted. So that's how it began. But then I worked so well with the editor. I was frustrated with academia. I wanted to reach a larger audience. All these things came together, and I started writing for Smithsonian Magazine, which I love.
Can you tell us what this means to work so well with an editor? Some of us have only very brief back and forth. So what did that mean?
The editor had been there for a very long time. The editors at Smithsonian are divided into different, niche areas. And she was in charge of museums, meaning if there's a piece of art that's in the museum and they want to feature it, there's a new exhibition coming out, it has to be related to the museums in some way. So we really got along. We kind of kept the same hours, which are later hours, and she would respond right away so we could get things done quickly. I really appreciated her comments. She got me thinking in different ways. She just pushed me, and we wrote many articles together. She was just terrific. Unfortunately, she retired, but it was a really good partnership. She's the best editor I've ever had at either a popular publication or in my academic writing.
That's great. Something you mentioned is the getting back to someone right away. I mean, I guess especially when you're trying to get something done, there's something about that I think that makes both people feel like, okay, we're really working together and I can count on this person.
Absolutely. I really appreciated her response time, and she appreciated mine. And it's just that we worked together so well. It just made it easy. We could kick things out. We could meet deadlines. And so what ended up happening there is she would offer me projects. She would say, here's some exhibitions that are opening soon. Are you interested in covering it? And she knew what my interests were. So I mostly worked with the Smithsonian American Art Museum because I'm mostly an Americanist. But I was also interested in other types of projects. I did a really interesting article about a book called Horse. And it was a very popular book at the time. And the research for the book was actually done at the Smithsonian. So I got to talk with the author and do a little bit of research. It was fun. So many of these projects opened my mind. I may not even be an expert on that artist. Like Dale Chihuly, I knew very little about. I don't work with those kinds of objects usually. But I did a project on him. I learned so much. So it's fun. I get to learn. I get to write. I get to craft. It's a really good partnership. I love working for the magazine.
Another aspect of that, it sounds like you said they were kind of pushing you in new directions. Did that mean you were responding in this way where you were letting them know, oh, I didn't think of that, but I love that idea? I mean, was there a lot of positivity? Is that also how this might have felt good to both of you?
I think so. I think because her name was Beth.
Mm-hmm.
Her name is Beth. Beth and I each brought something different to that partnership. She's been working for the Smithsonian Magazine. It had been for decades. And I was one of her first writers ever that actually has serious art history training, right? You have journalists who are working on the projects that she would potentially offer, might say no to many, but now she has an art historian who has the contacts, who knows the curators, who knows specialists in the academic world, and knows how to describe art, knows how to really talk about art. It was really great.
And you mentioned too that you'd been feeling some dissatisfaction with academic publishing, maybe academic writing too. Can you tell us about what it was at that point?
I had written a lot of books by that moment, and I was trained in theory. This was a long time ago. I was in graduate school in the 90s in an art history program, and it was very theory based. We had to read part of the standard edition of Freud. We had to read Lacan. My first book, which came out in a long time ago in 2004, it had a little bit of theory in it, and I found it to be, looking back at it, and it's interesting. I think you might really, see this too. I looked back at it and I could barely recognize. I wrote every single word, but I didn't even, it was like reading something new. I was kind of impressed with myself, but also in some ways not. There were areas that were not accessible in this book. And so with all of that, I just felt like I wanted something more and something different. I needed that new challenge. I had done a little bit of writing for the more mainstream press when I had a book come out in conjunction with the 75th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And I realized, wait a second, more people might read this book if I can publish an article discussing some of my research in an accessible way. And that book allowed for it. The book was about, it is called The Warsaw Ghetto in American Art and Culture. And it discussed the Warsaw Ghetto from when the uprising happened all the way to almost the current time in film, literature, theater, poetry, fine arts, you name it. So I talked to a friend who was a journalist, and he said, try for the best right away. Well, I had not really ever written any journalistic articles, but I contacted Time Magazine and they took it, which I have to say was a really exciting moment to me at the time. And I wrote for that. And it was so gratifying that thousands of people read that article versus maybe 500 people have ever read my book on the Warsaw Ghetto and American art and culture.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a big difference. So was that, it sounds like with time, was it a historical anniversary you were saying that was sort of the timeliness hook?
Exactly. The timeliness hook is key. That book came out in 2018, again, the 75th anniversary. And I've subsequently learned that you need that peg when it comes to journalism. So I've continually looked ahead for pegs, thought about other kinds of ways to connect to a larger audience who's interested in a subject at that moment. And I had that opportunity a few years ago. I published something in the Washington Post, because my book that comes out September 9th is about a 19th century Jewish American sculptor who was the first Jewish cadet. His name's Moses Jacob Ezekiel, the first Jewish cadet at the Virginia Military Institute, and he was a Confederate soldier during the Civil War. After he graduated, he became an expatriate and he made Confederate monuments. So this perfectly intersected at the time with Black Lives Matter, with the tearing down of Confederate monuments. So I proposed something along those lines to the Washington Post, and I got to write a great piece, which of course, again, was gratifying that so many people got to learn about that particular monument, which is, as of yesterday, in the news again. The monument I'm speaking about, unbeknownst to most people until my article came out with the Washington Post, was made by a Jewish American Confederate artist veteran. And so just the other day, it was announced that Trump would like that monument re-erected in Arlington. I'm not saying that's a good thing at all.
Yeah. Yeah, about the excitingness of having your work read by many more people, it sounds like. I don't know if you have anything to say about how this does actually change your job or how you feel about your work as a historian or your actual life. I mean, some scholars who haven't had that experience might wonder, okay, so what does that change if your work is more out there being read by more people?
I think it's changed my passion at this particular time in my career. I was burned out by academic writing. I was frustrated by the lack of readership. And what I've done in the past, I am proud of. I'm adding to a scholarly conversation, in particular in my situation, about Jewish American artists. When I was in graduate school, and I should know, I graduated with my PhD in 2001. There was very little work about Jewish American artists. There were plenty of really famous American artists who were Jewish that no one ever talked about as Jewish. No one explored their Jewish identity in conjunction with their artwork. There was one person, Matthew Begel, and that was really it. I'm very proud of all of this sort of foundational work I've done for future art historians and Jewish studies scholars. But I think I'm ready to do something else. And I'm writing about some of those artists for the mainstream press. And so others will get to learn that Audrey Flack, well, she's the premier female, and there is that adjective there, photorealist, and she was labeled as such. She was the first photorealist to have a work in MoMA and a woman, but she's also Jewish, and she made works that have Jewish undertones or very overt Jewish tones. No one's ever talked about them. So that is what I've hoped to contribute over time. But now there's a new direction in my career.
Yeah. Samantha, you and I met, actually, I think we were on a Cleveland Jewish history panel years ago, but I remember we didn't get much of a chance to talk. And then we met again this past fall when we were both at an event at the American Jewish Historical Association in New York. And you were telling me that you were actually in town also to do an event for one of the artists you write about, which was when I realized that your career kind of seemed to have a different shape because of the kind of writing you were doing about living artists. And you weren't always doing that, but I guess you have been recently. And I wonder if you can tell us about how you came to write about living artists and how this has actually changed the writing and the career.
My first book was about an artist who died in the 1980s. And it's interesting, when I finished that book, people would say, "Oh, did you ever meet Raphael Sawyer?" And I'd say, "No, I was a teenager when he died." But my next book was an encyclopedia of Jewish American artists, which is something I'm particularly proud of because it lays that foundation that I referred to. So I was writing that book, and I sent a form letter out with the exact same questions to every living Jewish American artist. Do you think your art is Jewish? Yes or no, and why? How would you define Jewish art? And so forth. There was I didn't want to burden them. I think it was 6 to 8 questions with, at the time, a self-addressed stamped envelope to mail it back to me, my home phone number, or email if the artist used email. But a lot of these artists were very advanced in age. And that encyclopedia has been the bread and butter of everything I've done since. There were 80 plus artists. I had to do primary research on every single one. I knew every major source on every single one. And I've gone back and worked on all, different artists from that encyclopedia over time. These were extended essays, more than just an encyclopedia article, focusing on their careers, but also some of these Jewish elements no one has ever talked about. So the encyclopedia is how I met or learned about some of these living artists. And Jack Levine was one of them. And I got to meet him. So I sent him the questionnaire, and he was a tough one to find. I actually wrote an essay about that. At that particular moment, I had to get a New York City phone book and look for all the Jack Levines, Jay Levines, you name it. Mm-hmm. And I cold called them from Cleveland and talking really fast because they were hanging up on me.
Right.
Is this a Jack Levine who's an artist? So finally, I think it was the 13th, it's New York, the 13th or 14th, a gruff voice says, "I'm Jack Levine, the artist." And we start to talk. He said, "I'm 90. If you want to really talk to me, you should come to New York right away." So I did. And I went and visited with him. I did a long interview with him that I've used for an article and a book chapter. And someday we'll donate that article to the Archives of American Art, which is part of the Smithsonian. And I've interviewed so many of those older living at the time artists that I'm going to give a little treasure trove to the archives. And it sort of took off from there. Audrey Flack, who I mentioned, this was very exciting for my young, I think first year as an assistant professor, called me. And I had called into my voicemail at home from work just to see if anything was going on I should know about. And there's a voicemail saying, This is Audrey Flack. I got your questionnaire. I'd like to talk to you about it. The rest of the day, I was floating on air. Audrey Flack called me. I went home and I called her. We had a great conversation. And she also said, why don't you come to New York? I'd love to meet you. And I can show you some of my personal art collection. So I did get on a plane relatively quickly. And we had a short interview scheduled. It ended up being 2 days.
Wow.
And for the last 20 years, we have been incredibly close. And I helped with her own art. I've written catalog essays for 2 exhibitions. I've helped her arrange exhibitions. She became one of my closest friends. And I have many interviews to help with her legacy. And she's the reason I got into Smithsonian Magazine, just to bring it full circle, because that was the first pitch that I had really made for them.
That's amazing. I mean, first, just the idea of sending out the kind of survey. A lot of historians, I feel like, would not think of doing that. What made you take that step?
I think that what would make me not take it, it's the first thing that came to mind. Like, if you can have a primary source, and I'm a modernist, then I should have the primary source. My master's thesis, which was so long ago, was about Rembrandt. And you don't really have any Rembrandt primary sources. So then when I got into decided to become a modernist, there were so many primary sources. Raphael Sawyer, who I mentioned was the first book, he wrote 4 autobiographies.
Oh.
And I had those, plus his personal papers were at the Archives of American Art. So I combed those back in the old day when it was microfilm and it was horrible and you'd get like headaches while looking at the papers, and then you'd mess up and it would like go so far ahead. I never knew where you were at. And since have been digitized. But that's why it occurred to me, I have to take advantage of this. And in fact, most of those artists are no longer alive. But I have this questionnaire they mailed back with their signatures at the bottom.
Yeah, that's really great. And so, like, for instance, when I saw you this fall in New York, you were doing something with the artists. Like, what kind of events do you actually end up doing in person with them?
With Audrey, we've done some public events where we're both sitting on a table in front of a gigantic audience because they're all coming to see her, but I'm facilitating the conversation. We did something at, I think it was Baruch College, and she was in a band. She was endlessly creative. She was an Audrey Flack in the art history band. The band played. We did an interview. I did give some sort of presentation about the Jewishness of her art as well. It was like a symposium about Audrey. So we've done things like, I did things like that with her. Her exhibitions I would go to, and I wrote the catalog essays. So I would help shape the way people would see her exhibitions and see her art. But other artists, I've curated the work of Archie Rand, who is a Jewish American artist who is very prolific and has lots of different kinds of exhibitions. And I've curated a few. And we also would speak together. I would do interviews with him, either in person, which was recent at the Heller Museum in New York. But during COVID, we did a few different kinds of interviews as well online for groups who could not really have a lot of access to art.
Yeah, that is great. I mean, hopefully this is encouragement for listeners who might be considering writing about living writers or artists. It sounds like this really added to your life, these events and relationships.
Oh, it's been so fun. I feel really lucky because my vocation is my avocation. And don't tell my dean or provost this, but I would absolutely do this exact same thing with my life, whether it was my job or not.
Yeah. You know, many of us, even if we're not art historians, have scenes or image that we're trying to convey in our writing. So I'm just wondering, Samantha, if you can tell us about describing art vividly in writing.
So this is not just my job as a writer, but I teach my students how to describe art. I have a survey class, which is nearly impossible, the Renaissance to the present in one semester. But while they may remember the key crucial works of art, like Mona Lisa or Rembrandt's The Jewish Bride, they are going to learn how to talk about art in writing as well as verbally, and can enjoy art museums, ideally, for the rest of their lives. So the key to writing about art is, first of all, artworks are not illustrations. When there are authors who just put a work of art into a book as an illustration, it's very frustrating to me because that's not what it's about. So what art historians start with doing is a formal analysis. So like talking about the formal qualities of an object, and formal as related to form, not a black tie dinner. I always have to tell my students that. They get so confused. So I think the key for someone who's looking at art is you look at the individual design elements. That's where you start. Composition, which is like the arrangement of parts in a work. Color, line, texture, scale, proportion, balance, contrast, and rhythm. I think those are sort of the key elements. And the concern there is we have to think about and explain how an artist arranges and uses these elements. You can't just assume that your reader is going to see it the way you see it. So in every book that I write or article, I describe the object first and set the stage for my reader. And so the way I might describe Moses Ezekiel's Arlington Confederate Monument would be different than the way another art historian would describe it. I'm focusing, let's say, on different elements. And you have to look at objects for a really long time. I can come back to an object and see different things. But the key is once you get a grasp on that object, you're translating something from a visual language to a textual language. And it's that deep looking, it's the vital task of an art historian or someone who also wants to talk about art in a real way. And it's about scrutinizing an object. You figure it out, what it looks like visually. You describe it, you explain it, and then you interpret it. Why did an artist make this object? How did they make it? Then you comment on the significance of what you've observed. When you're a professional art historian, you connect all of that to the primary documents you might find, right? The history of the moment. There's just so many different aspects that you bring together to then create an argument and make that object alive for its own time and the current moment.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And relatedly, I wanted to ask you, since you've published so many books with images, I wonder if you have any kind of lessons you've learned about getting a publisher, a press, an editor to include more images. I know that's something, even I have wondered about. Like, I feel like I have to kind of bargain with them. And if you feel like you found that there are certain presses that do this better than others.
All right. Yes, bargaining is key. It's the perfect word, Rachel. Images are the bane of an art historian's existence. I can tell you that there were days where I rued the fact that I decided to become an art historian and not, say, a literature professor. Because in those early days, so I'm going back to when I finished graduate school, almost 25 years ago. And my first book, which was on Raphael Sawyer, oh my gosh, the illustrations took me 6 months. I didn't have a research assistant. Finding the image, because it wasn't like you could go online and it's just there somewhere. There was no real online anything. So I'm, really struggling at that moment, trying to find, who do I get? I find the artist. Then I find out if the artist is dead, which I would know. You have to find who holds copyright. You have to find the family. What if there's an estate? Because I don't work on, at that time, I wasn't working on huge artists where how to get a permission for a Jackson Pollock. So, like, the Thomas Hart Benton estate, how do I contact them? You can't just look online. And it was really frustrating and exhausting. So you have to get permission from the family in a document. You have to get permission potentially from the museum. You then have to pay the museum for the rights to use the photograph or transparency that they had. And if they didn't have a photograph of the work of art, you have to pay extra to have them do the photograph of the work of art. And that's still to this day. And that could take a long time. Image permissions still are horrible. There's the Artists' Rights Society, which you don't want to have to work with if you don't have to, because they also make it hard. But an important thing for probably most of your listeners is to tell whomever you're trying to get permission from, this is an academic book being published by a not-for-profit press. This is not commercial use. Can you please take that into consideration when assessing the fees?
Because you found there actually is some flexibility there.
There is a huge amount of flexibility, not when I first started, but now they even sometimes have contracts, like when you're checking off what you want. where
Hmm.
you check off less than 3,000 copies, or, you know, academic press, academic use only. And so there's much more options, but there's a lot of begging and pleading involved. I had a book that was almost like a survey book of modern Jewish art, Europe, Israel, and America. And that came out over 10 years ago, long before Wikimedia, which is also a really good thing. And it was $10,000 worth of images in that book. There were well over 100 images in color. It's exhausting. You have to, in this case, which might be helpful, you need to find money, because as academics, we don't have extra money. So in the past, I have gotten money from my dean. That's one option, explaining that the book cannot be published in its best form without some funding, and ask for it. But I've also applied for a lot of grants over time that have provided subventions for my books.
Yeah. And in terms of presses, are there any that you recommend as being better for this?
I've only published with art history presses because they're better with it, because they deal with images. They understand there's a form letter they have that you send to artists or museums that they can provide for you. You know, at this point, I have plenty of those. But for a first time author, if you're going to work with images, you want to work with an art history press. If it's an art history book, are heavily dependent on visual analysis. They know how to deal with images. They know how to promote your book. And so my press, the Ezekiel book comes out with Penn State University Press next month. As we said, they're phenomenal. They're one of the best known art history presses, great to work with. And I've had over 100 images in my 3 books that have been published with them.
Well, yeah. And in terms of price, I didn't look to see how much these books are, but is there ever a possibility of making them a little more purchasable for the average person? How has that worked for you?
Absolutely. The key there is grants. I had a book called Jewish Artists in the Bible in 20th Century America, which featured Audrey Flack in one chapter, in part because I got all this great information from her, and Jack Levine, who I also met as one chapter. And for that book, I got an NEH, so a National Endowment for the Humanities year-long grant. And in the proposal I wrote into it, part of this grant is going to go towards a subvention for my book.
Mm.
And it was not an unsubstantial amount.
Hmm.
That helped pay for all the images and bring the price down significantly.
Hmm.
So it was, I don't remember how much it was. Maybe it was 39. It was definitely under 50, which I think
Yeah.
is like 55 is the threshold I found. So it was not, and it had how many images? 117 images, and 39 were color. It was a beautiful book.
Hmm.
And then, so that's how I've applied. The Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture has given me a subvention before. The Hadassah Brandeis Institute has given me a subvention before. And then, of course, you always go back to the dean.
Yeah. Okay. Well, those are great ideas. I didn't think of how people might include this in grant applications.
Mhm.
And it sounds like that's received okay. I mean, it's trying to put the scholarship out so that more people can get their hands on it. I also wanted to ask you, Samantha, last summer you published a really wonderful op-ed in CNN on CNN.com. The title was, quote, "My uncle was tossed in a mass grave beside Nazis. He'll finally be reburied under a Star of David." So a little outside of the kind of art history realm that you're usually in, what made you decide to write this, and how did it work getting it to CNN.com?
Oh, well, this op-ed is connected to one of the most remarkable things that has happened in my life, and probably one of the most remarkable things that could happen, that happened for in general in the last year. But my great uncle Nathan Baskind fought at D-Day, then survived D-Day, but then fought in the Battle of Cherbourg, was shot, and had been missing in action. I received an email now a year and a half ago saying we might have a lead on your uncle. And it turned into a tremendous year of worry and excitement and possibility that they may find his remains somewhere after this jagged scar that has run through my family, that Nate was never found. And he had a twin sister. His brother was my grandfather, Sam, who I'm named after. And after we had to get permission from 3 different governments to find Uncle Nate's bones, he was buried in the German military cemetery at Normandy. but it's French land and the German, with over 50 German bodies, Nazis and German soldiers. So to make a long story short, we found him among thousands and thousands of bones. And it's remarkable the machinations to make it happen. So I had, as the next of kin, I had to make some pretty challenging decisions. What is his casket going to look like? I had to choose his casket. I had to choose where we were going to bury him. The family cemetery at Squirrel Hill, Arlington, in Normandy. So in the end, I made all those decisions. It kind of wiped out a year for me in many ways. And it's coming close. I've been a little bit stuck by the whole emotional part of it. It's like 4 days before I'm leaving for Normandy. And I realize I need to write about this. So one night for 7 hours, I write the piece. I contact a friend who had been writing for CNN and said, can you give me your contact's name? Would you mind? I sent him the article. He said, oh my gosh, I'm sending you my contact's name. And I sent it to her and she said, we want it. And I have to say, of anything I've ever written, it was very passionate. It came out, it completely flowed out of me and it needed no edits. It's the most perfect thing I ever wrote from the get-go. I mean, so many things have gone through, weeks and months and years of edits, but this just came and it was published for CNN. It's my most read piece I've ever written. They contacted me in the first week. 10,000 people have already read it. And I feel really gratified I got my Uncle Nate's story out there.
Yeah. I mean, has this pushed you or made you think about more trade press kind of books so that the books would also be heading in that direction?
You have read my mind. In fact, I'm in the middle of doing something new. I'm pitching this book to agents. As an academic, I've never had an agent before. So once again, and I think this is important for your listeners, I'm constantly asking for help, even at this point in my career. I have a friend who had an agent, and I said, what does a book proposal look like that you submit to an agent? He sent me his book proposal for a mainstream book. And yes, I'm looking for an agent right now. I've sent out a couple query letters. I'm trying to perfect the actual proposal. It's a very compelling story, and I think I'll get an agent. But once I get an agent, then I need to get a publisher. But I'm in the middle of writing it. The book is halfway done. My next book is about my Uncle Nate, and it's a detective story. It's an immigrant story. It's a war story. It really brings together a lot of elements that I think are going to be interesting for a larger audience.
Yeah, I think so too. Best wishes with that. That sounds really great. Before, Samantha, you and I had been talking or we touched on rather the issue of writing and parenting and just sort of family and writing and balancing or not balancing. I wonder if you can tell us how this has worked for you or how it's changed for you over time.
Being a parent is exhausting. Before I had kids, I had unlimited time, right? It was so easy. I could write what I wanted to write. There was no noise. There were no distractions. There were really no obligations. I have a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old. So it's been a long time of writing now with children in the house. Everything got derailed by COVID. When my young children, they were 11 and 12 years old at the time, in 5th grade and 7th grade. I'm a single mom. I had them 24/7. I was going crazy, like a lot of people were going crazy, but I'm also at the same time was trying to write a book. And it was my Ezekiel book. Most of my books come out every 3 to 4 years. The Ezekiel book is coming out 7 years after my last book. Because one, the kid distraction from COVID, and they were in and out of school for 2 different grades. It spanned 5th and 6th grade and 7th and 8th grade for both children. I was home teaching them, and they were also noisy. But the noise factor has always been a factor. My writing routine has entirely changed. So now I'm not someone who can be distracted. If the minute there's a distraction, like a phone call, or a kid playing on their iPad or whatever, that's it. I'm done. It's hard for me to get back in the groove. So what I do now is when my children go to sleep, and this is from a young age, I start writing. There's no distractions. So I'm not exaggerating when I say from 10 o'clock at night until 2 or 3 in the morning is when I write.
Wow. I mean, so many of us who are, I don't know, over what age, 30, 40, are exhausted by evening or just really so things are really starting to shut down then. So I don't know how you figured out how to have energy then.
It was necessity. I
Mhm.
love to write. I could only write. Again, it's this I have to have complete quiet. I'm easily distracted. And I would get frustrated with the kids when I was trying to write, say, after I fed them dinner. They're going to invariably make noise. So to keep our family happy and together, I had to change things.
Mm,
And I don't know. I think I've trained my body.
mhm.
I now write better when it's completely quiet, when it's dark out. Sometimes I'll get into a groove and the sun will be coming up
Hmm.
or the New York Times hits the door
Wow.
and I realize I've just written for that long. Now,
Wow.
don't get me wrong. The next couple days, I'm pretty crushed. So after I pull, like if it ends up being like a 10-hour marathon, I've now earned 2 nights of going to sleep early. But I need to keep this train going. And
Mm.
it's the only way was to have these sort of night out hours.
Yeah, and I imagine, maybe that's easier during the summer or days when you're not teaching kind of thing?
It really is anytime. And it's more during the school year
Mm,
because in the summer, the kids go to overnight camp and
mm,
then I can be normal.
right. Yeah, well, that's great that you were able to change things. There's 2 questions that we ask of all guests, and one is, what is something you wish you had known about writing or publishing earlier in your academic career?
I wish I had known that I don't have to agree with all the peer review comments for my articles and books. I used to think I had to respond to all of them, even if I didn't agree for my argument or what that comment was. So now, I mean, not for a very long time now, I realize I can talk to the journal editor or my book editor and say, these are the elements that I agree with. They're going to make my project better. And these just don't, this is what the reader the reader of that report wants to have written. They can write that article. I don't need to write that article.
So that's interesting. Is that, an email that you might have with them before you write the reply or as you're submitting the reply to them, just sort of explaining?
No, this is in response to
Mhm.
whatever report that I get, because there have been occasions where every single comment is good. And I'm thrilled. When I was younger, I used to use those submissions and the reports to make my work better. But at this particular time in my career, I have so many colleagues that we work together and trade our articles and comment on them, and we have that kind of relationship. I have some go-to friends, and we just trade back and forth.
Yeah, so it sounds like you feel like you've already gotten some pretty good readers' reports, even maybe before it's submitted to the journal.
Right. Your friends find the holes.
Yeah.
Your friends see where you could, when you don't have a fresh eye anymore, then those friends that I have in my different kinds of writing groups have been really helpful.
That's great. I mean, guests have often commented either they have some of those kind of writing groups or they, wish they had or, groups fall apart. So it's wonderful that it sounds like you've been able to keep that network up. There's another question that we ask, which is about whether there is a writing habit or practice that's been working for you.
A writing practice that works for me is I involve myself in one of my current projects every single day.
Hmm.
No matter, it might not be writing it. It could be researching it. But there's no day, including Saturday and Sunday, where it's not an hour or more. I mean, usually on Saturday and Sunday, it's an hour. It doesn't matter how exhausted I am or if one of my kids is thrown up at bedtime, or especially if I'm frustrated with what I'm reading.
Yeah.
And I must come back and engage in some way.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I agree. I think that it's you sort of feel better when you're keeping up the engagement. Well, thank you so much, Samantha. This has been really fun and interesting. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me on the podcast today to talk about, as I said, my vocation and avocation. It's always a joy to talk about writing.
Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.